The Juke Joint was packed that Saturday night in April 1937. Bodies pressed against bodies, sweat dripping from the low ceiling, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Robert Johnson sat in the corner, his guitar cradled like a sleeping child, his fingers dancing across the strings with that impossible grace that made grown men question everything they thought they knew about music. And then, in the middle of Hellhound on My Trail, something changed. His fingers kept moving, but his eyes went somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere dark. The music continued, perfect and haunting, but Robert Johnson wasn't there anymore. He was staring at the back wall of that cramped Mississippi Juke Joint like he could see straight through it, straight into another world entirely. And every single person in that room felt it. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather, a silence beneath the music, a fear that crawled up their spines and whispered that they were witnessing something they were never meant to see. Few people know what really happened that night in that forgotten corner of the Delta. The witnesses are long gone now, their stories scattered like dust in the wind. But the tale survived, passed down in whispers, in late-night conversations between old blues musicians who remember when the music still carried something ancient and dangerous in its bones. This is the story of the night Robert Johnson stared into nothing, and nothing stared back. Before we walk down this dark road together, subscribe to Soul Chronicles and hit that notification bell, because every story we tell here carries a piece of the souls who dared to touch the impossible. Leave a comment telling me which blues legend you want me to uncover next, because each one of these stories guards a secret that the world tried to forget. The year was 1937, and Robert Johnson was at the height of his brief, burning career. He'd been playing for less than 2 years with that supernatural skill that made other guitarists walk away from their instruments in shame. They'd seen him before, back in 1935, struggling with the basics, barely able to keep time. Then he disappeared for months, maybe 6, maybe 8, nobody quite remembers exactly. When he came back, he wasn't the same man. His playing had transformed into something that defied explanation, techniques that seasoned musicians couldn't replicate, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than wood and wire, a voice that carried the weight of something ancient, something that predated the cotton fields and the chain gangs, something that reached back to the crossroads where roads meet and decisions are made that can never be unmade. The Juke Joint that night was owned by a man named Willie Brown, not the famous Willie Brown who played with Charlie Patton, but a different Willie, a quiet man who ran a quiet place where people came to forget their troubles for a few hours. It was a small building, barely more than a shack, with wooden planks for walls and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. The kind of place where the music was everything, where the outside world with its rules and its hatred couldn't reach, at least not until sunrise. Robert had played there before, always in the corner, always with his back partially to the wall, always with that strange intensity that made people uncomfortable even as they couldn't stop listening. He never smiled much, never engaged in the usual banter between songs. He'd play, take a drink, play some more, and then disappear into the night like smoke dissolving in the wind. But this night was different. The crowd was larger than usual. Word had spread that Robert Johnson was coming, and people had walked miles, some from neighboring counties, to hear the man who played like the devil himself had tuned his guitar. They packed into Willie's place, shoulder to shoulder, until there was barely room to breathe. Robert arrived late, as he often did. He walked in without greeting anyone, his guitar case in one hand, a bottle in the other. He made his way to his usual corner, sat down on a wooden crate, and began to tune. The crowd quieted, waiting, anticipating the moment when those fingers would begin their impossible dance. He started with Sweet Home Chicago, a song that got feet moving and spirits lifting, then Crossroad Blues, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the press of bodies. His voice cut through the smoke and noise like a blade, raw and vulnerable and somehow ancient all at once. Then came Hellhound on My Trail. If you know the song, you know its power. If you don't, imagine the sound of a man running from something that cannot be outrun. Imagine the musical embodiment of fear itself, of looking over your shoulder and knowing that what follows you will never stop, will never tire, will never show mercy. Robert's fingers moved across the fretboard with that liquid precision that seemed physically impossible. His voice rose and fell, cracked and soared, painting pictures of darkness and pursuit, of sins that could not be washed away, of debts that would eventually come due. And then, 47 seconds into the second verse, according to a man named Luther Hayes, who was there and who told this story until the day he died in 1983, Robert Johnson's eyes changed. They didn't close, they didn't blink, they just left. His gaze fixed on the back wall of the juke joint, but he wasn't seeing that wall. He was seeing something beyond it, something that made his face go slack, made the color drain from his dark skin until he looked almost gray in the lamplight. But the music didn't stop. His hands continued playing, perfect and precise, every note exactly where it needed to be, every slide and hammer-on executed with flawless technique. It was as if his body knew the song so deeply that it could play without his conscious mind, as if the music had become something separate from the man, something that lived in his fingers and would continue regardless of where his soul had gone. The crowd noticed. How could they not? The closest dancers stopped moving first, their instincts telling them something was wrong before their minds could catch up. Then the people around them noticed, and the people around them, until the whole room had gone still except for the terrible, beautiful music coming from the corner where Robert Johnson sat and stared at nothing. It was like watching a man drown, Luther Hayes said years later, like watching someone go underwater and not come back up, except he was just sitting there and the music kept playing, and we all knew we should look away, but we couldn't. We were frozen there, watching him disappear right in front of us. A woman named Sarah Coleman, who ran a cafe down the road and who sometimes sang at Willie's place, later told her daughter that she felt something in that room that night, something that made her want to run, but her legs wouldn't work. She said it was like the air got heavy, like the shadows in the corners got darker and started moving, even though there was no wind, no reason for them to move at all. His eyes were open, she said, wide open, but ain't nobody home behind them. And the way he was looking, or not looking, it was like he was seeing hell itself. Like whatever he sold to get that music, it came to show him what he bought. The song continued. 2 minutes. 3. Robert's voice cracked on the lyrics about the hellhound on his trail, and some people swore they heard not one voice, but two, as if something was singing along with him, something that knew those words from experience rather than imagination. Thunder rolled in the distance, even though the night had been clear when people arrived. Or maybe it wasn't thunder at all. Maybe it was just the sound of the moment, the weight of it, manifesting as something the mind could understand. Would you keep playing if your mind went somewhere else? If your soul stepped out of your body for a moment, would your hands remember what to do? Or was something else playing through him, using him as an instrument itself, finishing the song because the song demanded to be finished? A man named Clarence Washington, who played harmonica and who knew Robert from before his transformation, started moving toward him, thinking maybe he should shake him, snap him out of it, bring him back from wherever he'd gone. But Willie Brown put a hand on Clarence's shoulder and held him back. "Don't," Willie whispered. "Don't touch him while he's like that." "Why not?" Clarence asked. "Because if you pull him back too fast, he might not come back at all." They stood there in the heavy silence beneath the music, watching, waiting, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loud, afraid that any disruption might shatter something fragile and essential and leave Robert Johnson's body sitting in that corner with no one inside it ever again. The song built toward its climax, Robert's voice rising into that high, keening wail that sounded like a man being torn apart, and his fingers moved faster, the notes tumbling over each other like water rushing downhill, like a man running full speed from something that had already caught him. And then, as the final chord rang out and faded into silence, Robert Johnson blinked. Just once, slow, deliberate, like a man waking from a dream he couldn't quite remember. He looked down at his guitar, as if surprised to find it in his hands. Then he looked up at the crowd, at all those frozen faces staring at him with fear and wonder and confusion written across them in the dim lamplight. "What?" he said, his voice rough, confused. "What y'all looking at?" Nobody answered at first. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and thick. Finally, Sarah Coleman found her voice. "Robert," she said softly, "where did you go?" He looked at her, his eyes focusing with difficulty, like a man trying to remember something from years ago, rather than seconds. "Go?" he repeated. "I didn't go nowhere. I was right here." "You weren't here," Clarence said. "Your hands were here, but you went somewhere." Robert's face changed then. Something flickered across it, recognition maybe, or memory, or fear. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his guitar, and for a moment it looked like he might say something, might explain, might share whatever terrible thing he'd seen, while his eyes looked at that wall and through it and beyond it. But he didn't. He packed his guitar in silence, his movements quick and jerky, uncharacteristic of his usual fluid grace. He took his bottle, still mostly full, and walked toward the door. People parted to let him through, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid touching him, as if whatever had happened might be contagious, might transfer through contact. At the door, he paused. He turned back, and in the lamplight his face looked older than it should have, worn and tired and haunted. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying in the absolute silence of the room. "Sometimes when you play the blues real deep, you go to the place where the blues lives. And that place," he trailed off, shook his head, "that place ain't meant for the living." Then he was gone, out into the Mississippi night, leaving behind a room full of people who would never quite forget what they'd witnessed, who would tell the story in hushed voices for the rest of their lives, who would argue about the details but agree on the essential truth. They'd seen Robert Johnson go somewhere while his body stayed behind, and wherever that somewhere was, it was dark and terrible and real. The juke joint closed early that night. Willie Brown sent everyone home, and he later told people that he could still feel something in that corner where Robert had sat, something cold and watching, something that made him avoid that spot for weeks afterward. Dr. Richard Collins, a folklorist who spent decades studying the life and legend of Robert Johnson, interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have been at Willie's that night, or who knew someone who was. The details varied, as they always do with stories passed down through time and memory, but certain elements remained consistent across all the tellings. The stare, the continuing music, the sense of something wrong, something unnatural, the feeling that they were witnessing something that violated the normal rules of reality, that they were seeing through a crack in the world into something that should have remained hidden. What's fascinating, Dr. Collins wrote in his 1979 paper on Robert Johnson's performance style, is that this incident, or one very similar to it, appears in multiple independent accounts from different sources. Either something genuinely unusual happened that night, or the legend grew so powerful that it convinced people they'd witnessed it even if they hadn't. Either way, it speaks to the extraordinary effect Johnson had on his audiences, the sense that he was channeling something beyond mere technical skill. But was it just performance? Was Robert Johnson simply so immersed in his music that he entered a trance-like state, a kind of flow so deep that his conscious mind temporarily disengaged? Musicians throughout history have described similar experiences, moments where they feel like they're not playing the music, but being played by it, where their hands move without conscious thought, and the notes seem to come from somewhere else. Or was it something more? Something connected to the stories that circulated about him, about the crossroads and the deal and the price he paid for fingers that moved like magic and a voice that could make stone weep. 3 months after that night at Willie's juke joint, Robert Johnson was dead. Poisoned, most likely, by the jealous husband of a woman he'd been seeing. He died in agony, according to witnesses, crawling on his hands and knees, barking like a dog, his body racked with convulsions. But some people, the ones who were at Willie's that night, wondered if the poison was really what killed him, or if it was just the final payment on a debt that had been accumulating with every note he played, every song he sang. Every moment his eyes went somewhere else and saw things they weren't meant to see. Sarah Coleman's daughter, interviewed in 1995, remembered her mother telling her the story late one night. She said Robert Johnson looked like a man who'd seen his own grave, the daughter recalled. And she said once you see your own grave while you're still alive, you start walking toward it whether you want to or not. There were other incidents, other stories of Robert Johnson going somewhere while his body stayed behind. A show in Memphis where he allegedly played for 10 minutes with his eyes rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. A street corner performance in Helena where witnesses claimed his shadow moved independently of his body, dancing to rhythms he hadn't played yet. But the night at Willie's Juke Joint remained the most documented, the most consistent across multiple tellings, the one that seemed to carry the most weight of truth beneath the layers of legend and fear. What did he see when he stared at that wall? What place did his mind go to while his fingers continued their impossible work? Was it memory or vision, past or future, hell, or just the deepest parts of his own troubled soul? Perhaps the answer lies in the music itself. Hellhound on My Trail isn't just a song about being pursued. It's a song about inevitability, about running from something that's already caught you, about trying to escape a fate that was sealed the moment you made a choice you could never unmake. Listen to the recording he made of it, the one preserved for posterity in that San Antonio hotel room in November 1936. Listen to the way his voice cracks on certain words, the way the guitar seems to echo his fear, the way the whole thing feels less like a performance and more like a confession, a desperate attempt to put into music something too terrible for words alone. And ask yourself, what kind of experience produces music like that? What does a man have to see, have to feel, have to know to pour that much authentic terror and beauty into 3 minutes of blues? The people at Willie's that night saw something. Whether it was a glimpse into Robert Johnson's tortured psyche, a manifestation of genuine supernatural forces, or simply the profound effect of a master musician completely lost in his art, they saw something that stayed with them, that changed them, that made them understand that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Willie Brown's Juke Joint burned down in 1942. Some say it was an accident, a lamp knocked over during a fight. Others claim Willie burned it himself, that he could never shake the feeling that something had been left behind in that corner, something that waited in the shadows and watched whoever came too close. The exact location is disputed now. The delta has changed, roads have been rerouted, buildings have risen and fallen. Maybe that's for the best. Some places carry echoes of what happened in them, and some echoes are better left to fade. Robert Johnson recorded only 29 songs in his lifetime. 29 songs that changed the course of American music, that influenced everyone from Muddy Waters to Eric Clapton, that proved the blues could be both deeply personal and universally powerful. 29 songs created in a career that lasted less than 3 years from anonymity to legend. And in those 29 songs, if you listen closely, you can hear moments where it sounds like someone else is playing, like someone else is singing, like Robert Johnson himself has stepped aside and something else has taken over, something that knows the blues not as a musical form, but as a living, breathing force of darkness and truth. Maybe that's what the people at Willie's saw that night. Maybe they saw the moment when Robert Johnson stepped aside and let the blues play through him, pure and undiluted, without any human filter to soften its edges or hide its truth. Maybe that's why they were so afraid. Not because Robert had gone somewhere, but because something had come to where he was, something that lived in the music and used his hands and voice to make itself known to the world. The blues has always been about truth, about looking at the darkness without flinching, about naming the pain and the loss and the longing that most people try to hide away. And truth, real truth, is a frightening thing. It demands something from you. It changes you. It shows you things about yourself and the world that you might prefer to never know. Robert Johnson knew that. He lived it. And on that night in April 1937, in a packed juke joint in Mississippi, he showed a room full of people just how deep that truth could go, how far into the darkness a man could stare before the darkness started staring back. Perhaps the real question isn't what Robert Johnson saw that night. Perhaps the real question is what saw him, what recognized him, what claimed him as its own. And perhaps the answer is in the music, has always been in the music, waiting for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen closely and follow where it leads. Before we part ways, if this story sent chills down your spine, hit that like button and subscribe to Soul Chronicles. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Was it a trance, a vision, or something darker? Because here, every soul has a song to be told, and some of those songs were never meant to end. The night Robert Johnson stared into nothing, something stared back. And in that exchange, in that moment of connection between a man and whatever waited in the darkness, the blues became more than music. It became a doorway. And some doorways, once opened, can never be fully closed. The music plays on, even now, decades after Robert Johnson crawled on the floor of a Delta farmhouse and died in agony at 27 years old. The music plays on, carrying with it that moment when his eyes went empty and his fingers kept moving, and everyone in that juke joint understood, without words, without explanation, that they were witnessing something that shouldn't exist. Maybe that's the real legacy of Robert Johnson. Not the songs themselves, though they're masterpieces, not the techniques, though they're still studied and marveled at, but the proof that music can take you somewhere, can transport you beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience, can open your eyes to truths that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. And maybe, just maybe, the price of that gift is that sometimes you go too far, see too much, stay too long in places where the living aren't meant to linger. The blues will do that to you if you let it in deep enough. Robert Johnson let it in all the way. And what he found there, in that deep place where the blues lives, was enough to make him stare at nothing while a room full of people watched and felt fear crawl up their spines like frost on a winter morning. The song ended, the moment passed, the night moved on. But for those who were there, who witnessed it, who felt it in their bones, nothing was ever quite the same again. Because they'd seen the truth that Robert Johnson sang about in every song, that some knowledge comes at a cost, that some power demands payment, and that the blues, the real blues, the deep blues, is more than music. It's a conversation with the darkness. And sometimes the darkness answers back.